All right, so we've got our super hot textures all ready and done up here in InstaMAT, and we want to go and export these now. To do that, let's come on up to File, down to Export Image and Data Outputs, and the hotkey is Control-O. And that's going to bring up yet another daunting dialog box here. But again, don't worry, it's pretty straightforward once we kind of get the hang of it. So the first thing you'll want to do is select an output path here. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and also change the file format again before you export. So you're not locked into whatever you decided to choose at the beginning of the project. Now, this dilation in percentage option, I would probably bring that up to either 50% or whatever, but I would make sure to not have it off, especially if you're doing like 3D model assets with textures. You're going to want to have some dilation on your textures so that you're not getting some like seam bleeding in your model wherever you decide to bring it. So just make sure that this is set up. Now here we get to go ahead and decide which material sections we can export. Now we only have one, so it's going to be pretty obvious what we want to export. And we can also set the dimensions here as well. So I'm going to just set 2K for export and just make sure that our material is enabled. And you can see it's to the right and it's blue. Now underneath, you can see all of the different channels and maps that we can export, as well as the color space that we'll be exporting them in. But I don't want to do that. Now we could, and you could export these individually, but you're going to get a bunch of different individual texture maps. But what if we wanted to go ahead and channel pack? Now, if you haven't watched my Substance video on exporting, channel packing is where we start to store a couple of these grayscale images together into one texture image, which we can then use later on and actually read out the individual color channels so that we aren't importing, 5 different textures for a particular material, but instead can maybe reduce that to something like 3. So the way that we can do that is we need to use a template. So you can see that no template is active over here on the right-hand side. We can use some built-in templates. You can see that I have a little test template here, which I was playing around with. But probably chances are you're going to want to create one first. So let's click on this little plus button to add a template. I'm going to call this tread, and you can give it a little description as well. A really cool template. All right, so once we do that, you can see that the dialog gets way more intimidating. I didn't think it could get even more, but here we are. And it's grayed out everything in here. You can see that it's managed by our output template. So basically, because we've created a template, and you can see we're now using this template down here, it is now overriding the textures that we're going to be exporting. So if you did follow along with the Substance video, this might look a little familiar, but the idea is that each one of these is a particular image channel. Now I wish I could kind of make the UI a little bit bigger, but hopefully you guys can see this on your monitors. So this first one here has a green socket, which indicates that this is a color channel. You can also see that it has individual channels here. So I can call this something like base color. And now I want to make sure that this is actually outputting that albedo base color channel. So down here, we have a bunch of those color outputs, and you can see that we have the base color here. So if I click and drag this, and I start to drop this on one of those channels, I'll start with the RGB. You can see that I can map this as an RGBA image or an RGB image. I can also drop this into one of the individual color channels. Now, because the base color is a color output, it's not going to really work as intended, trying to map it to one of the channels. So instead, let's map it as an RGB image. So you can see now the base color is mapped to this output. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this and create a new RGBA. And let's call this normal so that we can export our normal map. So let's go and drag and drop this into the RGB. Now I might do this as an RGBA just because normal compression is a little bit better when you have an alpha channel. Now finally, let's add another RGBA, and I'm going to call this RMA. So what RMA stands for, if you didn't watch the substance video, roughness, metallic, and ambient occlusion. So here's where channel packing comes into play. I'm going to go and find our roughness, drag that into the red channel, and you can see that the roughness is going to be slot in because it's a grayscale texture, which indicates that it's only working with black to white values. We can actually slot it into individual color channels, and we're going to be able to read this information correctly from this texture once we bring it into another application like Blender or Unreal Engine. I'm also going to drop our metalness into the green and ambient occlusion into the blue. Now you'll notice that we have this little more button here. If I click on that, right, there's a bunch of other channels that we can work with to start to export. But fortunately, all of the ones I wanted were right up at the top because they're the most common. So we've set up a template. If we take a look back down here, because we have this template set, we can see that we're going to export the base color, normal, and RMA. And these templates are really useful so that you can, if you're working in a particular workflow or like a art style, you can create these templates so that you don't have to do this every time. And then you can start to select them from here. So if I wanted to, select the individual channels, I can just select no template active. Or if I'm working on tread projects, I can go and select tread and it's all going to be set up for me. So once I go ahead and make sure to set my output path, I can just click on export and it should relatively quickly render those textures out so that I can have them for use in my game engine.